Hello, everyone, and welcome to this 44th Urban AI conversation, for which I have the great pleasure of welcoming Emily Royall. Hi, Emily.
Hey, everybody. Hi, Hubert.
So it's really a huge pleasure of having you, Emily. Also because you are part of the Urban AI community, you're a member of the Urban AI board. So you've been really actively supporting this journey almost for the very first time. So it's really a huge pleasure to have this opportunity to learn more about your own journey and also, in a sense, your past experiences, professional experiences, academic experiences. So just some elements of context if you're just joining, how we frame this conversation. It will be a kind of fireside chat, 45 minutes fireside chat, during which we will actually explore gradually the background of Emily. The goal is really to try to better understand in a sense, like what brings Emily where she is here today. And you will see that it's really fascinating, some of the position, statement, and also like the work Emily is doing to advance public interest AI. So that will be one of our leitmotifs. So kind of casual discussion in a sense. As usual, if you have reactions, comments, questions, feel free to use the chat during the live discussions. It's been made for this. And yeah, so let's start. Maybe, Emily, first question regarding actually your academic background. So you studied at MIT in urban planning. And I actually saw while studying your past experience that you also then taught courses titled Urban Ideals and Action at MIT. And I was wondering, so what is it, this course? What does it encapsulate actually?
Wow, that is a throwback. I haven't thought about that course in ages. So yes, I was a teaching assistant for that course at MIT, and really the goal was to reflect and think about the perceptions that we have of urbanism theoretically, and talk about how that actually plays out in the 2020 hindsight vision of historical perspective. So what we specifically talked about in that class was actually the development of Eastern and Western Germany and after World War II and the fall of the Berlin Wall. And so we explored the various socioeconomic conditions of those two worlds and how that led to very different styles and motifs of physical architecture and urban design. And kind of seeing how those economic forces shaped those specific examples. I remember that being a focus, but man, Hubert, that was more than 10 years ago. So I'm trying to remember everything that we talked about. But one thing that I do want to play out, that I think is kind of interesting as it relates to urban ideals, is prior to going to MIT for urban studies, I did my undergraduate at the University of Texas at Austin in neuroscience. And I talk to young people all the time, students or people just entering their careers. And they're so, focused and concerned about how they can have a practical impact and, find a job ultimately. And I reflect a lot on, that opportunity that I had to really connect a lot of disciplines together that were really siloed, I think, at that time, and really connect these different views together to sort of create a specific pathway or methodology for tackling urban problems. And in my undergrad, I was really just learning big data and how to process and analyze really big data sets, mostly about the human brain, about biological functions and activities, within the human body. And in doing so and picking up computational statistics and machine learning and really like prototypical AI, we were using, some basic machine learning and statistical functions to anticipate and predict effects of certain experiments and outcomes. I started picking up that skill set, but I quickly discovered that I really wasn't interested in applying that skill set to studying the human brain. I wanted to study cities and larger systems, and through happenstance, really just serendipity, I ended up connecting with a woman at a dinner who was a CEO of her own urban design firm. And turns out she and I really hit it off, and she ended up hiring me right out of college with my neuroscience degree in an urban design and planning firm. And really was interested in borrowing my skill set of computational analysis and big data analysis to import that into her urban planning, design and systems that she was trying to use data to anticipate and build, different urban plans for the Texas and Austin region. And in doing that, that's where I kind of started bringing those worlds together. And then I applied for graduate school and ultimately ended up going to MIT specifically for that reason, to like fuse and connect those two worlds together and experiment with that.
So that's thanks to this very specific meeting with this woman that you shifted, in a sense, from neuroscience to urban planning?
Yes, very much so. I remember it very clearly. I was actually studying for a neuroscience exam, and I really didn't want to do it, honestly. And so I put down my computer and I decided actually to go to a urban design charrette that was happening in downtown Austin at the time. And I kind of crashed the party. I showed up and participated, and I really found my milieu, right? I found my place there amongst all of these architects and urban designers, and met this woman. So I just like to emphasize often for young people, it's maybe not always like a linear path that you control and that you know exactly, each stage of your professional development. Sometimes following your intuition and being open to new experiences really puts you in the right place that you need to be.
Did you? I'm also asking this question because actually, I think it was now a few years ago. We had a question. We had an urban AI conversation with All Things Urban, an amazing platform on like urban AI jobs and like how you navigate your future and how you know like what you want to do. When you say that you entered this milieu, did you spontaneously, immediately know that it was for you? Like you felt it, or did you have to process it?
No, I felt connected to the work. I had never been exposed to a profession where people were thinking about the built environment and um, designing its future, right? And I thought, well, a lot of this is very subjective. It would be cool if we could apply some analytical thinking to this, some big data analysis, and using data to make predictions and study cities as more holistic organic systems, and borrow some of those analogies from the sciences and apply those to urban planning. And it turns out there's a lot of thinkers that have done that before me, even certainly before me. And I think that was really kind of the space that I found myself in before the smart cities movement really materialized. So this would have been like 2010, 2012. And smart cities had not really taken off yet at that time, but tech companies were beginning to accumulate large quantities of data that were very relevant for urban planning purposes. So think about e-scooters or Lyft or Uber, accumulating massive amount of trip data and last mile transportation data that urban planners at that time in our government institutions had no access to, and no real skill set or awareness for how to analyze massive large quantities of data. So for me, coming into that space from the sciences, being interested in urban planning at a time where we were seeing more platform urbanism, more technological interventions that were accumulating large data sets about cities, it was a really good time to think about applying artificial intelligence or machine learning techniques to analyzing and understanding data for urban planning and design purposes.
So you also had the experience then following actually what you just shared, like in internationally, actually in Singapore. Also, I saw, and I also saw that you worked as a San Antonio report, a local newspaper, and I was really wondering, like how it happened that you arrived in this organization. Yeah.
All right. Well, those are two different stories, but I'll start with the first, which is Singapore. So when I was in my studies at MIT, I had the opportunity to apply for an opening that was an data analyst, essentially, and policy analyst position in a laboratory that was being stood up by Andres Sepsuk, who is a faculty now in urban planning at MIT. And he was starting a laboratory in Singapore as a former MIT faculty to really apply those big data techniques to studying urban conditions in Southeast Asia and Singapore. So some examples of projects that we worked on, one was using big data sets to develop essentially formulas for predicting population dynamics and growth in Singapore's commercial districts. So we could anticipate, how much housing, how much commercial planning should we build, et cetera. So we did a lot of work for the Singaporean government to assist with technical analyses to inform how they were thinking about how to build and plan for Singapore in the next, 10 to 20 years. Similarly, we did a project for a client, which is the municipality of Denpasar, which is in the Bali province. So folks might be familiar with Bali, a very popular vacation area. Well, behind Bali, there is the main jurisdiction or province of Bali, which is Denpasar. And Denpasar was very forward thinking. They wanted to build a GIS laboratory, and they were funded by the World Bank to stand up a laboratory to enable them to do this kind of digital mapping of their community and of informal settlements in the area. And we did a lot of very grassroots work to enter into these communities and survey them and basically create data sets from scratch where there were none to inform things like how do we get sanitation services through the informal settlement communities that are extremely organic, that are mirroring the topography, that have very very tangible intersections with local religion and culture. For example, Denpasar did not have a government census. What they had was almost like a priest that was responsible for their entire district, and he would report data to the government about his community. So that was, really the way that data collection was materializing in some of these rural or informal communities. And it was a very interesting, I would say, like technical question, but also an ethical one of applying a Western sensibility about mapping and understanding these communities on top of what were, incredibly organic, informal settlements that were really hard to like map and extract data. And we were trying to like help the city government allocate services, but at the same time, render these cities, these informal settlements, legible to government entities, which I think has a lot of pros and cons around that work. So I learned a lot about that layer of ethics and the role that governments play in the process of urban development.
How were you like mapping the informal settlements? Were you using, I don't know, ground technologies, or how did you do it?
We were making base layers from scratch. So we would go to the informal settlement and we basically notated like in a software. I forget what we were using at the time. This would have been like, again, like 10 years ago. So I don't know if that software even exists anymore. But we were like actually tracing, like creating base layers from scratch with iPads, going into, these communities, and then going back and populating that with LiDAR data or other, different things that we could use to form those base layers for the Denpasar government. And, for them, their challenge was we have these incredible informal settlement communities people don't have access to sanitation, public transportation. They're hard to reach communities, right? And so the government was really interested in figuring out how it could allocate services, but also how it could increase its tax base and tax these communities, right? Because they are using city services, but they're informal. They're not at a home address with a zip code, right? And so that was another task that we were doing, was like creating the data substrate that would enable the government to provision services.
Did it change like your approach of the city? Because when you are talking about like those informal settlements and this kind of informality, I had in mind, popping up some sentences from Richard Sennett on the open city and those kind of area which are very dynamic, but because of their informality.
Yeah.
So did it change really like how you envision what is a city and what is good for a city based on this?
Absolutely. What comes to mind is Jane Jacobs and a lot of her writing of the North End in Boston, which was considered a slum at the time, because it was very organic, kind of informal settlement style community, meaning that it was just like a conglomeration of apartments and makeshift housing, right? And similarly in Denpasar, there was a lot of that as well. But Jane Jacobs taught us that these things that we formalize, like security, like transportation, things like that, are also occurring in more informal ways that don't necessarily have to be, formally designed or built to support cities, that we should accept and appreciate the existing kind of like natural or organic means of like one example that she gives that I really love is there's no alarm system, right? In the North End, there's no, security system that's formal of any kind. There's just eyes on the street. That's a really famous example. And so that's how security is manifesting, in the informal settlement that's perceived as a slum. It just doesn't look the way that you might think, or it's not corporatized in one form or another as a formal security system. And so similarly, there's a lot of stuff like that, I think, also in Denpasar. And it helped me really appreciate, I guess, the very different modalities of human settlement, and that we have to think carefully about using government as a way to actually improve people's lives, versus allowing the sort of organic, maybe non-traditional settlement to persist, right? There's like a balance there, because yes, like folks need access to electricity, to broadband internet, to sanitation services, which requires a formalization of infrastructure in a lot of ways. But at the same time, what's the trade-off when you go and maybe destroy an organic street and replace that with a highly legible, highway, for example, right? Like those are the trade-offs that I think are challenging to make in environments where there is a lot of growth and a lot of development occurring, which largely is happening now in the global South.
Super interesting. And regarding the San Antonio reports, the local newspaper, so how did you write there?
Well, I think I had kind of a formative moment when I was at MIT, which was, I think at the time, Google came to present its Sidewalk Labs project, which had a very famous development in Canada, which was called the Quayside project. And that was a waterfront development that Google was interested in investing in and funding through this company called Sidewalk Labs. And its promise was to collect data using smart city technology at multiple layers of living in the settlement. So if you lived there, you might live in a smart home that would gather data about how much trash you're throwing out, how much electricity you're using, right? All of these different parameters. And then that data would be more or less ingested by Google and analyzed, right, as an experiment in this settlement. And I think that they were coming to really recruit folks from MIT to support that effort. And there was a big presentation there. And I looked at that and I really felt like there was something missing in that presentation, where there was a lot of utopianism and excitement for the promise of these technologies, but not a lot of discussion about the impacts that it would have on civil liberties and data privacy. And I found that to be kind of a problematic juxtaposition. And that opened up for me what I think ultimately is like my sort of North Star mission, which is public interest technology, meaning sort of technology by the people for the people, right? And so I have experimented in my career with a lot of different components of public interest technology. The first being open data. So many years ago, there's like a big push and interest surrounding open data and making data a public asset. And when I returned to my hometown, which is San Antonio, Texas, I had the opportunity to explore the way that journalism, hyperlocal nonprofit news, could empower and democratize access to data to residents locally. So I was really interested in that. And, coming fresh out of grad school, I was like looking for jobs, and that was something that materialized for me. And so I just went ahead and went for it and worked locally in this nonprofit newsroom and data journalism essentially for a little more than a year. But what I worked on there was open data, building an open data platform, using our articles and the ways that we are informing our community as opportunities to generate and share data, kind of similar to what we were doing in Denpasar for the government, and building data sets where there were none. And for example, one data set that did not exist in San Antonio was broadband internet access. Turns out when somebody, meaning me and the community, took all of the data that was out there for that and mapped it, we discovered major disparities that fell along socioeconomic lines in our community, meaning that our folks who had lower incomes in our communities, who were disproportionately marginalized groups, were the folks who also did not have broadband internet access at home. So that map that I created at the San Antonio report ended up being a really important tool for advocates in our community to go and advocate for more broadband funding and subsidizing internet access for our low-income communities in San Antonio. And that was a kind of a cool way to see how when we unlock data assets and make those accessible to our communities, communities know what to do with that. They use that to empower themselves and to advocate for the systems and services that they want to see. So that time at the San Antonio report was very much about unlocking data and data access to our residents. But it really was just one piece of the much bigger picture of public interest technology.
That's very interesting because we will discuss it later, but maybe so 10 years ago, like you recently published an article where you mentioned that one of the critical elements of AI for being fair is to be transparent. And that's quite interesting to see that maybe 10 years ago or some years ago in this kind of local newspaper, this is already something you were pursuing, this quest for transparency, but not for the sake of transparency itself, but to empower communities and giving them like data knowledge to use in a sense.
Yeah, it's a really weird experience for me to hear you have done your research and gone back and found things I wrote 10 years ago. It's helpful for me because, I feel less crazy. Like, yeah, there's a through line, right? But yeah, I think that's what I was thinking about theoretically, and just like, attacking the problem from the point of how do we just unlock data and like, doing that in an applied way for my community, my hometown. Was really informative for me. And it led to kind of like my next step, which was doing that work in government.
Okay. We saw it already, like with like this work you did in Singapore, and then when you came back to San Antonio. But when like someone can have a look, like also at other experiences you had, and it's very interesting to see this kind of mix between highly international experiences. So you also worked at UN Habitat. You had there actually different missions, and in the same time hyper-local work, such as hyper-local projects, such as this one with the San Antonio report, and obviously we will discuss it, like the role you had at the city of San Antonio. And I was wondering, and it's also interest me because sometimes I can find have this kind of same duality between international and very local. And so did you have this kind of changes because you have also this kind of duality, or yeah?
Yeah, what a great question. Well, I think it's a question for anyone to ask themselves, is like, what scale do you want to approach your problem, right? And so I think that reflects experimentation of different scales to tackle how to truly authentically build public interest technology. And um, I think that it's been really informative because I find that working locally, in San Antonio, in local government in San Antonio, in local journalism in San Antonio, the scale is so much smaller that you're working with, albeit San Antonio is a pretty large city, but still. And you just have this like really applied practical perspective where you have to answer to the day-to-day realities of your constituents. You have to answer to your city council. You have to address, so many different real world challenges that are part of solving, for your problem, right? And taking that and applying it at the national or international level is actually really valuable, because when you import that experience at that level, I think there's a lot of interest in, how do you provide materials and support and guidance for cities that's relevant universally, but also practical. And I think that's the sort of mandate of UN Habitat is, working in this national lens, but making resources very applicable and useful for city governments that are actually at the front lines of these challenges on the ground. The team that I worked with at that time at UN Habitat was incredible. Pontus Westerberg was leading our group. And, he was very visionary in thinking about how UN resources could be applied and, easy to use and understand for city governments. And so I think he and I had a meeting of the minds, if you will, because I think he had that vision for UN Habitat. And I came with a lot of that applied experience from working in a local community in smart cities. And so we could really take those two worlds and combine them to produce some pretty cool outputs, which included the people-centered smart city playbooks that UN Habitat released. I was a lead author on those, but it was a team effort. I had a whole team of UN Habitat staff that were supporting me and Pontus in building those playbooks out, with the intention of them being really easy to use and understand for governments that are facing urgent situations and don't have time to read, a bunch of theoretical white papers, or scientific papers on these topics. They need to address, challenging issues right away. And we built a lot of resources for that in the smart city space. That was pretty cool. I had a friend describe me once as transcaler, which I think is a great word. It's such a great word to reflect that play that happens when you do things at a very large scale and then you do things at a very small scale. I think you understand your problem in much more depth when you are working at very different levels within your space.
How do you manage creating operationality and practicality at a global scale? Because at local scale, maybe it's intuitive, or maybe I might be wrong, but we can see in a sense how by being immersed in a kind of local network, you have at least accountability, face-to-face interactions. But at global scale, it really looks more complicated. So what did you learn from your experience at UN Habitat?
Well, I learned one that there really isn't a one size fits all approach to any of these things, but there are common challenges that I think governments face across the board globally. I also learned that, um, you know, cities in wildly different contexts are innovating solutions that are useful for other cities everywhere. So, for example, when we released the playbooks, we did some trainings and we partnered with a nonprofit group that was supporting city governments in Africa. And it was really cool to, kind of address all of these different challenges with these governments and discover that some of these cities, had really done incredible innovation that needed to be uplifted and shared with Western governments, for example, especially in the realm of data governance. A lot of these cities were very proficient in how they were governing data for smart city development. And sometimes those, like, you don't have the opportunity when you're working locally to see or witness that kind of innovation that's happening in other governments. So working at kind of that national level gives you exposure to a lot of different ways that people are innovating globally to solve for different problems. There's also limits to that too. For example, I think it's really challenging to develop any form of legislation or, you know, actionable policy or guidance at an international level. I think it's very challenging, especially when you look at AI, for example, and how that is playing out legislatively in the United States. We have federal level, we have state level, we have local level, and we don't really have federally mandated legislation around AI. So different states are legislating in different ways, and that creates trickle down effects at the local level. So I think having overarching international guidance can sometimes miss the mark a bit because it's hard to be responsive to some of those local challenges. But at the same time, there are issues that I think, such as AI, that require sort of urgent international response and coordination. And I think institutions like the UN are very well equipped to do that and to address that. But the application will look very different at different levels of government.
So if we keep, in a sense, exploring your background, we see that once, I think at the same period, or just before actually entering the UN, you also started your position as Smart City Coordinator for the city of San Antonio. So can you explain concretely what does it mean being the Smart City Coordinator of the city of San Antonio?
Yes. So at the time, we had a city manager that was very forward thinking, and her name was Cheryl Scully. She had set up a team that was the Office of Innovation for the city of San Antonio that was really dedicated to, not just finding efficiencies in government, but also innovating and trailblazing new pathways for how to serve our residents better. And one of the subdivisions of that office was the Smart Cities team. And the intention was to really look ahead at what technologies we needed to anticipate as a government and design inclusive governance models and approaches to integrating those technologies to improve services for residents. So I was hired on to support that team. at that time, coming from nonprofit news and going into government, which was quite a transition, right? I really would say it took about 3 years to just understand government, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity. But it was an interesting blend of folks who had never been in government before. And that was kind of a good thing because we were challenging a lot of the norms and the status quo of how things were done. And at the same time, over time, getting smarter about, how to find the actually accomplish and deliver the results that we wanted to see for residents. And what we were really passionate about, and then I was soon after promoted and got to manage the team. And what we focused on was building San Antonio's first ever smart city plan. And we took the approach, which was very much modeled at UN Habitat as well, of people-centered smart cities, which meant doing our very best to engage and interact with as many constituents as possible and create ways that they could actually inform the investments that the city of San Antonio was making in new technologies. And that really was the Smarter Together Smart Cities Roadmap that we put together. That was the product of boots on the ground engagement with residents in San Antonio across 10 city districts. Our city is 500 square miles, so it's a big city. There's 1.7 million people in San Antonio. So, we did a lot of work to really capture the resident voice and perspective and understand what their needs and challenges were, and used a lot of data to do that too. So kind of some things coming full circle. And residents told us their pain points. They told us what they really needed solved in San Antonio, which was basic things. They wanted better infrastructure. They wanted access to broadband internet. They wanted to easily be able to use digital services online. All of those challenges really was an opportunity to humanize all the exciting technology products that vendors were building and offering to government at the time. And it gave us a roadmap and a mandate to filter all of those products according to addressing residents' actual needs. So then the question became, how do we implement this? And that's where, we had another layer of really exciting innovation in governance and how we built the models within government to execute to the plan, which, sounds a little esoteric, but it's very challenging for governments to act quickly, to buy and integrate new technologies in safe and transparent ways. And so we were lucky enough in San Antonio at the time to have a team that was dedicated to building processes within government that would enable the city to be able to adopt technologies quickly and at scale, provided that they were responsive to the needs of our residents. And I thought that was just like a really cool dynamic model that we built, because a lot of times cities will buy technology and then later be like, did this work for people or not? Or, you'll focus too much on, creating the buy-in, but you struggle to actually purchase and use the technology. So we found some cool ways and approaches to enable San Antonio to do that.
So that was definitely not only about technologies, it was much more broader, both in terms of the vision, but also on the application. You mentioned in the beginning, like you basically came to the people, and that's really a topic actually that is interesting us. And I mean, when I say us, I'm also referring to previous urban area conversations. We welcome the city of Nantes, the city of Eindhoven, the city of Bogota, like many cities that are really working on going close to their citizens for AI policies or smart cities. So I'm really interested in learning more on how did you do concretely, like to collect opinions, feedback from your habitants.
Yeah. So we took the approach that was basically meeting residents where they are, making these conversations fun and accessible. because not everybody in your community is thinking about, deep topics in technology all the time. They're thinking about their daily lives. So what we tried to do was create a multi-channel approach, both in person and online, to solicit perspective from our residents. So yes, we had a digital survey. It was passively collecting data on the City of San Antonio's website. We also had, in-person events that we would go to, community events that were already happening. So we were not trying to set up town halls. We were trying to infiltrate into areas where our residents already were. So we would go to community festivals like Diwali, or we would go to coffee shops or breweries. We would try to meet residents where they were. We would go to community centers. We went to women's shelters. We went all over our community to just be present in the spaces where our residents gather, and use that as an opportunity to talk about what their pain points were living in San Antonio, and how could the city make investments in technology to support those challenges. And then we also created a really innovative program called Smart Essay Sandbox, which had the philosophy of, again, lowering that bar of access to public servants and to these discussions about technology. So we basically had a festival in public parks throughout San Antonio. We did it twice a year. It was free, open to the public. We would set up in a public park with a DJ, with all of these different community organizations that had something to do with technology. Maybe they were offering after-school programs for kids to do cybersecurity training, or maybe they were offering coding boot camps, or maybe they were offering adults the opportunity to sign up for vouchers for broadband internet. Anything that was technology related that there was a community service for, we brought those stakeholders together, and we celebrated all of that in a festival style public park event, and made it fun. When you showed up, you didn't see this as an official City of San Antonio town hall event. You saw it as something fun to do on a Saturday. And that really allowed us to have more intimate conversations with our residents, to understand, some of their needs, and how technology can serve those, but also empowering our young people to see themselves as creators of technology, not just consumers of technology, and really make the connection between, taking a coding boot camp and maybe going to work for the City of San Antonio and lending those skills to building better services for their community. So all of that dialogue was happening there, and the whole way we were collecting consistent data and incorporating that into our master plan.
Okay, so you used like all those kind of social infrastructural events, which I think that's really amazing, because like we know that sometimes public deliberations might be biased, or that we might very often have the same population, and actually going to the people and turning those events into something more joyful, relational, than indeed like very serious, which is maybe something we could have in mind when we are talking about tech.
Yeah.
That's a great idea. And so you had all those elements, you collected all those data, and then you used it to build your roadmap, your smart city roadmap.
Yes. And the other thing I'll add to that is we also recognize that the people on the front lines of service delivery, so government employees that want to serve their residents, but maybe are challenged in doing that because of broken technology or misaligned incentives, they also needed to be heard. And so we had another separate data collection effort where we surveyed city employees about what the roadblocks were that they experienced to delivering great services for San Antonians. And there we heard a lot of pain points around outdated systems, around, broken processes and workflows, things like that. And what we did was kind of combine those data sets together, and that really led us to a set of priorities for the city of San Antonio that reflected residents' needs, but also the challenges that our city staff were aware of as well.
Okay, maybe let's move. I see the time flying. That's why also. But maybe just one question regarding this this roadmap. Is there a name? If people want to have a look on it, what's the name of this?
Yeah, it's called Smarter Together.
Okay.
I think if you looked Smarter Together San Antonio, you could find it. I know that, it's the plan. The plan is a few years old now, so it's possible the website is no longer live, but you should be able to find a copy of it somewhere online.
Okay, Smarter Together.
Yeah.
Let's maybe now talk specifically about AI and more specifically about one of your recent article that you published. A super interesting article, really fascinating article. Cities need a new model for incentivizing responsible AI. And you start, in a sense, very strongly in this article because in the very first lines, you start saying basically we're AI systems were not designed for the reality of municipal environment. AI is not made for cities in a sense. Can you elaborate? What do you mean by this?
Yeah. So earlier, I was talking to you about how we built a great process in government for rapid prototyping, piloting these technologies, and then scaling them. And we built the process. We had the plan, built the process, and then we were like, great, let's begin. So we partnered with a bunch of different companies. We invited them to come sandbox with us. We would test and prototype these technologies and tools. And I was disappointed to discover that more often than not, the tools were not a good fit for government use, meaning that they had not been built with a government client in mind, but were being sold to governments. So often that meant that the technology just did not work. For example, a lot of AI technologies we were exploring were being trained in totally different environments in other cities, in laboratories. And so if we applied them to our context, the classifiers just didn't work. They failed. They failed to classify our unique conditions in San Antonio because they had been trained elsewhere. So that was surprising to me. And a number of different examples that I have in the article to sort of articulate that we were seeing failed accuracy thresholds being met. These systems just weren't working up to the standard that we required of them in a government or municipal setting. So, for example, if you're using generative AI to write a police report, the standard of accuracy for that should be very high. That generative AI should not be making mistakes on a police report, which is a legal document. And when testing, these kinds of tools in a real world environment, we would find this sits right 80% of the time, but that's not enough for that high risk use case. So what I started discovering was, we're really missing benchmarks, performance benchmarks that are unique to public sector use cases of AI and arguably any technology that is emerging, right? That there are not yet standards for. And while we have some research entities out there that are doing excellent work to benchmark foundational models like OpenAI, like Anthropic, Claude, et cetera, those benchmarks are not applicable to a specific government use, meaning that when I, as a government, am buying AI, I'm not buying from OpenAI. I'm buying from a company that is ingesting OpenAI as an API and integrating it into a software that performs a service for me. And so the benchmarks need to reflect that setup or that kind of dynamic rather than just being benchmarks about foundational models for AI. So that's kind of what led me into this new space of inquiry. where I realized even if we have all the data and the perfect plan and a great governance model, at the end of the day, the products just are not where they need to be to really serve our community. And so I think this next chapter for me is about how do we leverage the tools of government that we have, like procurement, to incentivize companies to build technologies to spec for government and make that a win-win situation. I think when governments are clear about the standards that they need for their unique use cases, it's easier to build technology that is responsive to that. So it's a two-way street. Governments need to have enough data and testing and evaluation of these tools to be able to say, hey, for a generative AI police report writing use case, we got to have 95%. And it's 95% accuracy across the board. That's what governments are comfortable with. Then I'm sure a company's going to go build that, right? And likewise, we have to enforce it and really incentivize companies to build the right tools that are the right fit for government.
Yeah, this is what you also shared in your article. There is a strong and immediate interest, not only for the public sector, but also for private sector and companies, because otherwise, I think you say in the article that basically local governments would stop buying technologies that do not fit with their own needs. So that's super interesting also to see that actually smart sector, like private companies, would benefit also from like better performance benchmarking. Can you explain? So you shared that it leads you where you are today at Partners for Public Good. So can you explain what is Partners for Public Good, and right now what is your mission as assistant director there?
Yes. So Partners for Public Good is a nonprofit that incorporated in March of this year. They were previously known as the Government Performance Lab at Harvard University, and they have spun off and become their own nonprofit entity. And their focus is providing governments across the US and North America with technical assistance and support to improve back office functions of government. And what we mean by that is these overlooked core functions of government that are not glorified. They're not, on the front page of most newspapers, right? But they are the fundamentals of how government works. That includes technology, IT. It includes HR, human resources, budgeting, and procurement, which is my new favorite word. So I now manage what's called the Procurement Excellence Network, which is a network of what is now 3,000 public procurement professionals. And our goal is to support and assist them with making improvements to procurement processes across the country, which is basically how governments buy goods and services. And I'm really passionate about learning this new skill set around procurement because I think it is probably the most important tool and power that governments have to incentivize markets to build products that are actually responsive to the needs of citizens. The public purse and stewarding that is a really powerful thing that I think we've forgotten about somehow or overlooked in a lot of ways. But there are people responsible in every government entity across North America and the world for making decisions about how governments invest in their communities. And being at the helm now of a group that is responsible for helping those people do their jobs better is really, really exciting and I think a powerful thing. And I'm excited to learn a lot more about those tools and the challenges of sort of our day-to-day procurement professionals, and then align that with, that broader mission of how do we leverage procurement to build better public interest technology?
So it means that you're already collaborating with different public entities to help them advance public interest technologies through procurement, in a sense.
Yes, absolutely. We provide assistance around how to buy, like how to purchase AI, for example, how to use AI to improve your procurement workflow. There's a lot of questions right now about AI, how to build contracts that avoid what's called vendor lock-in, which is when you contract with a company, but you're set up to only use them exclusively for like 5 years, which is really challenging in the technology space where there's a lot of evolution of technologies. The market is changing rapidly, it's growing very fast. And so it's really hard for governments to reform their procurement processes to be responsive to such an innovative industry and an innovative time in technology development.
Okay, well, that's really super interesting to see that procurements can be leveraged by public entities. So that's the case in the US, but that's also the case like in other countries in Europe, in Asia, as a way of gaining power, as a way really of kind of negotiating, creating trade-off, and also creating their own rules in a sense in like
Yes.
market-driven innovation.
Yes.
Well, thanks a lot, really, Emily. That was, I think we could have made another 1 hour, actually. We could have had 1 hour to discussion. It was really fascinating. It was really a huge pleasure. I truly believe you're one of the most inspirational leader in this field of like public sector technology and artificial intelligence. So that was really a great pleasure of welcoming you. Already at the end of this conversation. I hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you again. It will be next week, and we will welcome. I will have the pleasure of welcoming Linz Derry, who is actually a choreographer, and she is like using AI and merging AI with her choreography. You will see it's very clear when she explains it. Thanks, Emily. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.